Okay, we're moving on then to John Dee's Modus Hieroglyphica, but first I want to say a few biographical things about him. He was born in London in 1527 and died there in poverty and obscurity in 1608. So he lived a long life. He was about 81 years old. He was very precocious. At only 15, he studied at St. John's College in Cambridge, and in 1546 created one of the original fellows of Trinity College, Cambridge. And then at age 23, he went to Paris and gave lectures on Euclid that were absolutely stunning. Euclid had just been discovered, and Dee was the first to sort of import it, along with the entire Hermetic tradition, to England. So he is the center of Elizabethan England. He is the one who creates the entire cosmology by importing from the continent the Hermetic tradition, which, as we've seen, includes Kabbalah and alchemy and so forth, astrology. In 1555, Queen Mary put him in jail on suspicion of enchantments against her, but it was really her own fault because she invited him to read her horoscope, and her response was to put him in jail. She must not have liked the transits that she was having at the time. But then he fixed the exact date for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth I by casting her horoscope, correctly predicting, using astrology, because astrology actually is real and does work, to predict the date of her ascension. Now, he's been writing stuff all along, and his output is vast. It is quite large. We have lists of all the books that he had written. He had an entire library of about 3,000 books, something like that, which for London at that time was gigantic. In fact, it was the largest library anywhere in England. And at the time, Dee was the most learned man, not only in England, but also on the continent, within the Faustian civilization in the second half of the 16th century. And he belongs on the same plane as Leonardo and Goethe, James Joyce, characters like that, who are the best that the West has produced. Now, he has fallen into obscurity. After his death, he had already been in obscurity for about 10 years or so, because he has constantly been associated with witchcraft and conjuring demons. Whereas as far as he was concerned, he and Kelly were never conjuring demons. They were drawing down angelic influences using an Aztec mirror, which was probably thought to have magical properties at the time, since it had just been something that was recently unearthed and made its way over to England from the New World. So all this new stuff is going on. Meanwhile, Christopher Marlowe writes his Dr. Faustus, though it is based on an anonymous Faustbuch, and the real Faust lived about 1500, somewhere in there, and then long about the second half of the 16th century, the Faustbuch comes out of Germany. Marlowe gets his hands on it, and he says, hey, this kind of sounds like John Dee. And so he bases his character of Faust, Dr. Faustus, on Dee to show the bad things that will happen to you if you conjure demons or you dabble in black magic or these types of things. So that was written against him. And then, but meanwhile, the entire literary circle under Elizabeth, with Shakespeare, and Sir Philip Sidney especially was one of his pupils, as was Robert Dudley, who later becomes the Earl of Leicester. They were primary pupils. Spenser also. The Fairy Queen is entirely a vision that is unfolded of de-cosmology, let's say, as Frances Yates writes in her wonderful book, The Occult Philosophy in the Elizabethan Age. And so he was the center. He was the central mind of this entire development, just as in Italy, Pico della Mirandola had been the central mind, along with the Marsilio Ficino, but primarily Pico della Mirandola, of the entire Renaissance that was going on there in the 15th century. So Dee is to this court what the court of the Medici was, here, Queen Elizabeth. So his influence is enormous. Shakespeare's The Tempest was a play written about him. It is almost the only one of Shakespeare's plays that is not based on a pre-existent myth or story. So it was based on The Tempest. Prospero is The Tempest. And of course it was written shortly after he died in 1608. I think it's 1610, is it, for The Tempest, his last play. So he had some sympathy for Dee, at least Shakespeare did. Okay, and then so he writes the Modus Hieroglyphica in 1564 while he's on the continent at Antwerp. So he's back and forth his whole life between London and the continent, back and forth, back and forth. And in Antwerp, 1564, he writes it in 13 days. In the beginning of January, he's 37 years old, and he publishes that monstrosity. And it detonates like an atom bomb. It is the seed from which the Rosicrucians later derive, according to Francis Yates. If the Modus Hieroglyphica had never existed, there would have been no Rosicrucian movement, as we'll see. And Yates has a good proof for that. He marries Catherine Constable when he's 38 years old in 1565. They divorce after a while, and then he marries for the second time in 1575. It's a woman whose name we do not know, and she disappears. She dies the next year. Now, I talked to a medium about this, and the medium said that it was a woman who committed suicide. She hung herself. Then in 1577, he publishes the General and Rare Memorials pertaining to the perfect art of navigation. And it is in this book that the term British Empire appears for the first time. Dee was very political, very patriotic, and he may even have done some spying for Queen Elizabeth while he was on the continent. I don't doubt that. And he helped her create this vision of the British Empire as a naval empire. She made the mistake of trying to extend that to land in her war against the Netherlands, in which Sir Philip Sidney died there, and the Earl of Leicester came back, and he was disgraced. And but he sort of created in her mind this idea of a British Empire. So when he was 51 years old in 1578, he marries Jane Frohman, who will be with him for the rest of his life. She's only 23 at the time. And then a few years later, in 1582, he meets Edward Dee, who is a medium for him. But Dee also could do technical alchemy. The Modus Hieroglyphica is not a physical alchemy book. It's not technical alchemy. It is the alchemy of the mind. What is being transformed is the intellect. It is being put through a furnace, namely the furnace of Dee's text, and alchemically transformed so that the gold of the spirit can be drawn out of it through the study of his theorems. And so they wound up at the court in Poland. They wound up at the court of Rudolf II, who was fascinated with all things alchemical and magical and mystical. And now the Modus Hieroglyphica had been written to his father, Maximilian II, who was a very learned and literate man, written in Latin. And there's an opening letter that is dedicated to him that most scholars don't even bother to translate, but which Dr. Teresa Burns says is absolutely essential. It is the key. It's the hardest part of the book to understand, but it's absolutely essential. Once you understand that letter, then you have the key to understanding all the theorems that follow from it. So it's essential. And in my opinion, Teresa Burns is the best translator by far. The one I was using here was by Hamilton Jones. And there's also Yostin's, which I looked up online. Hers is by far the best for many reasons, which we'll get into momentarily. And then so Dee and Kelly with their wives are in Europe. They engage in wife swapping, and Kelly gets Jane Frohman pregnant. And Dee never forgave either one of them. His heart hardened against her. And Kelly dies in Prague in 1595. He never does return to England. He got in trouble with Rudolf for promising to make gold for him. That's not what alchemy is all about. It was never about the making of real gold. And then he returns to London, but the tide is turned against him. Elizabeth no longer wants him around. She gives him an appointment at Manchester College, makes him a warden there, but he gets into trouble. He's always getting into trouble with his peers because he's always insulting them by saying true things, and they are ignorant, and he is not. And then, he dies pretty much the last 10 years in poverty and obscurity. Okay, so that's the background of his life. Let's take a look then at the Modus Hieroglyphica. So it's published in Latin in 1564, and here is the title page. Now, every single detail in Dee is important. His mind is very much like James Joyce's in that respect. You cannot change a thing. And one of the reasons why these other translations are so bad is because they don't respect Dee's nomenclature, his use of font changes, his capital letters, his italics. They ignore all of that. But all of that, as we'll see, is absolutely essential to understanding him. There is nothing random, accidental, or merely decorative in Dee. Not one single thing. And Burns's book, which is available online only at Ouroboros Press there, I looked it up. It's $57. I didn't have time to get it, but that's where it is. Now, at the top it says, this is a very important thing here, in Latin, translated into English, it says, "One who does not understand should be silent or else learn. Precisely correct. If you can't understand the modus hieroglyphica, the fault is not Dee's, it's yours. Get back to the book and work on it harder. This is his statement for all of his life. People were, though he was famous, he was a superstar, an intellectual, what we would regard as a rock star. Today, he was the exact equivalent of that for England and Europe as a whole. Everybody knew this man, and his work was fundamental and influential on everything else that happened in the 17th century with regard to the Hermetic tradition, especially the Rosicrucians. All right, and then so we have the two pillars with fire at the top and air, and then he's got the sun on the one and the moon on the other. But of course, we know from alchemy that those are symbols for sulfur and mercury. And these are also the two pillars from the tradition of mercy and severity, or the Boaz and Yachin, as we saw on the tarot cards. Same tradition that he's inherited here. And then he's got the symbol, the monad itself, which is a glyph, a hieroglyph, but not a hieroglyph in the sense in which Egyptian hieroglyphs. People knew about them, of course, at the time, but they weren't translated. They didn't have the Rosetta Stone event yet. Instead, it's a sacred glyph. Hiero in the sense of Greek for sacred. It's a sacred glyph. In other words, a magical talisman that can be used to draw down spiritual influences and transform your life with them, to alchemically perfect yourself. So he's got the symbol for Mercury, and he's added these two little legs are the horns from Aries, and we'll see why that's significant in a bit. But notice that it's in the shape of an egg, because this is what is known as the philosopher's egg, which is in alchemy the retort itself, the alembic or the athanor or what have you, in which the transformations take place. And here, this isn't a book about physical alchemy, it's a book about intellectual alchemy, the transformation and perfection of the intellect through putting yourself into Dee's furnace, and he'll turn the fire up on you, I guarantee it. But it was also thought that the orbit of Mercury at the time was ovoid. So there's a reference to that as well. And then on the bottom we have a quote from Genesis 27, "May God give thee of the dew of heaven and of the fat of the earth." But notice that in Latin, the word for dew is ros, R-O-S. And so Francis Yates mentions this, that there have been conjectures that the Rosicrucian, the word rosy cross, the rosy crux, the rose cross, comes from this book from Dee, since after all, this glyph appears on the first chapter, on almost the first page, first or second page of the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, which is the founding gospel of the Rosicrucian tradition. So there again, there's a direct connection. Johann Valentin Andrii knew this text, read it, and incorporated it, and builds it into the Chemical Wedding. So all of this is connected together. Also remember too that in the book we were looking at in the alchemy discussion, the Mutus Liber, the silent book, the dew was what they were gathering, the contraption that they had laid on the ground for extracting dew, and they used dew to become the prima materia that they put through the transformations of alchemy. There are some background texts here, some contexts, as Professor Burns mentions, that should be taken into account. The book of Genesis, of course, absolutely, but also the Sefer Yetzirah. And we saw in the Kabbalah class that is the proto-text for Kabbalah, in which all 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet are used to construct the cosmos. And Dee has mastered the Hebrew alphabet. So he weaves in puns, Joycean allusions to numbers. There's numerology in here, all kinds of stuff. And Plato's Timaeus is also important, because in that text too, that the Timaeus is the demiurge who creates the cosmos out of geometrical forms. And then also the Emerald Tablet. The Emerald Tablet is not very long. It's only 12 propositions. And the first of them is the most important, as above, so below. And so what we will be doing here, let's move on to, now I've taken these as screenshots from Dr. Teresa Burns' lecture that she has on YouTube. She is absolutely, without question, the best Dee scholar in existence. She knows him backwards and forwards. So a little shout out to her. Okay, so Theorem 1. Now her translation, it's important to note that she respects his annotations. Let's read the first one here. By virtue of the straight line and the circle, the first and most simple manifestation of all things. non-existent or merely hidden in the veils of nature, is produced in light. Notice that line, circle, first, most simple, and nature are all capitalized because they are pure Platonic forms. When he is referring to a mere line drawn on a page, let's say, he won't capitalize it. And now in the Hamilton-Jones and in the Yaston translations, they don't respect that. They don't respect his capital letters. They don't respect his punctuation, all kinds of things. And consequently, it's evident from that they didn't really understand the text that they were translating. Burns and her companion, Dr. Nancy Turner, both of them got it right. They nailed it. That's why I'm using her translation here for the first 10 theorems, which is what we're going to go through, which will be the construction of the cosmos, but also the construction of the tree of life, the Sephirothic tree of life. And Theorem 1 corresponds to Keter because it is the beginnings of the light. Let there be light. So the light is absolutely important. That's another thing that the other translators have made a mistake in by leaving the light out. In Latin, it has in that text lucum productio, which is they leave it out. I'll read you Hamilton-Jones's translation. It is by the straight line and the circle that the first and most simple example and representation of all things may be demonstrated, whether such things be either non-existent or merely hidden under nature's veils. No reference to light there. But the light is essential. This is God saying, let there be light. Fiat lux, as she has over here on her page here. And then she quotes one of his aphorisms from the Propedumata. Whatever exists by action emits spherically upon the universe various rays, which in their own manner fill the whole universe. Now, the difference between a ray and a line in geometry is that a line can be extended from a point in either direction to infinity. That's a line. Whereas a ray emanates from a particular source downwards to infinity. And the ray that's being emitted here is the ray of the light of the Ein Sof. That's what's coming through here. And also the compass here and the straight edge remind us of, think of not just the demiurge in Plato, but also think of the Chinese creator characters in their mythology, Nukuat and Fuxi, the god and goddess who create the world using, one of them has a compass and the other has a square. It's just a right-angled straight edge. So what we're doing here, in accordance with the Emerald Tablet and its first proposition, as above, so below, is that we are miniaturizing the demiurge's act of creating the universe through this text by sitting here. And you can use a compass and a straight edge to construct every one of these shapes in all of these theorems. All right, so now you could say that the monus, which is the hieroglyphic monad here, which he introduces in Theorem 3, it is the monad, but it's also a reference to the lapis in alchemy. The prime. It could also be a reference, let's say, to Adam Kadmon, who dissolved and shattered and was torn apart like Osiris. His pieces became the klipoth that created the shadow tree of life. To the tree of life of light, there's also a shadow tree of light, a klipoth tree of shadowy emanations. So let's see here. Theorem 2, neither the circle without the line, nor the line without the point, can be artificially produced. Therefore, pierced by way of the monad, things are first begun. And that which is related to the periphery can in no way be employed without it. And so, in a way, he's evoking Nicholas of Cusanus' statement that God is an intelligible sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. So there's that. But there's also this idea that the piercing point is important, because back on that frontispiece, there was a Greek word on one of the banners to the side, stilbon. And he wrote it in Greek, that word stilbon, which is a pun on a stylus, but also bon, meaning the good, the summum bonum, the greatest good that the stylus is using. But it's also the idea that it's a point. And that point is the point that is in the center of the circle of the monad, from out of which creation emanates. All the sephirot, all the angels, all the Platonic forms, all come into manifestation in the physical world from that point. And it's remarkable, if you think about it, it's remarkably similar to our cosmology of the Big Bang with the production of light. Light is the first thing produced out of the Big Bang. So Theorem 1 then refers to Keter. So the appearance of the light, and Theorem 2 then would be Chokmah, the the wisdom. Okay, so Theorem 3 then. Therefore, the remarkable central point of the hieroglyphic monad refers to Earth, around which the sun, moon, and remaining planets complete their own courses. And so it sounds like he's geocentric here, that he doesn't believe the Copernican cosmology is correct. He knows very well that it's correct. He has to be politically careful here, because recall what happened to Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake in 1600 for saying that there were infinite universes, which was absolutely correct. He was right. The church was wrong. And also Galileo, so there's that. But there's also the fact that geocentrically considered, when an astrologer does a chart reading, he is reading your chart. You are the center of the cosmos, because the planets have relevance to where you're at geographically in terms of latitude and longitude on the Earth. It matters. So it is geocentric, because it's about you as the center of the universe. Otherwise, you don't have a reading. Nothing makes sense without that. And then so the sun and moon are capitalized because it's as though they were characters, sun, moon, and Earth, as though they were characters like Rex and Regina in alchemy, the king and the queen that we saw in the Rosarian Philosophorum. And so they are also Psyche. The moon is Psyche, and the sun also stands for spirit. And then, all right, let's move on to the rest of this theorem. And in this duty, because the sun itself assumes the highest dignity, we designate it, because of its excellence, by a complete circle with a visible center. And so, of course, with the hieroglyphic monad, the circle with the center in it is also the point of the compass that you use to make the circle, and the periphery around it is absolutely dependent upon that center. You can't have the periphery without the creative center there. It's also a symbol for gold. It's also a representation of the sun, and the crescent at the top is the representation for the moon, and the cross in the middle represents the four elements, and then the Aries sign at the bottom, which we'll get to what that means in a bit. All right. So Theorem 3 then. Although the half moon of the half circle of the moon appears here to be above the solar circle, and so to speak, nearly superior and first, the moon nevertheless regards the sun as her lord and king. She is seen to so rejoice in his shape and in being near him that she emulates the magnitude of his radius, as it appears to the common man, and always turns her light toward the same. Remember that, as we saw with the alchemy card in the tarot, with the angel pouring the light of the sun down into the light of the moon on the 14th day, it's the full moon. And that's also the soul receiving the light of the spirit, just as in Kabbalah, we have the soul there receiving the light as it comes down in broken shards in a ragged, jagged thunderbolt way down through those sephirot, down to us, down here below on the realm of Malkuth. And in this manner, so much does she long to be at last imbued with solar rays, that when she has been, as it were, transformed into him, she disappears from the sky altogether until, after a few days, she appears again horn-shaped, exactly as we have depicted here. And so the context is from the Emerald Tablet, what is below is like what is above, and also the fact that the sun is the monad's father and the moon is its mother. So he introduces the monad here. This is the glyph, the sacred glyph, the monad. Okay, so we'll move on to Theorem 4. Now notice here too that with Theorem 4 it's written with 4 ones, not IV. And so the reason for that is that the V is half, the V, the pentad, is half of the decad, and the decad is the perfect number that we'll get to here when we get to the 10th theorem. It's the perfect one. He also does not write the X with the 9, which is IX, but with the V and 4 ones, because the universe is still under construction here. The X is the completion. The X is Malkuth, the completion of the construction. And the pentad is half of that, so we haven't even constructed that yet. So, and translators do not, my version here in the Hamilton-Jones theorem has the theorem as IV. No, that's not the way he intended it to be written. These people don't understand this text. So although the half circle of the moon appears here to be above the solar circle, and so to speak, superior and first, the moon nevertheless regards the sun as her lord and king. Okay, so far. And then, so it's the conjunctio 2 in alchemy, the conjunction between the sun and moon, sulfur and mercury. But with this glyph, Dee has the idea that the entire cosmos can be constructed out of it. With the top part of the glyph, of course, we have the symbol for Taurus. In the bottom part, if you remove the legs and the moon, we have the symbol for Venus, and so forth. You can construct the entire Hermetic cosmology from out of this one little glyph here. Now let's look at Theorem 5. And certainly, by guiding the lunar half circle to the solar complement, one day is made out of morning and evening. Thus, this would be when the first light of the philosophers was made. So note that this is the 5, and the 5 is a pentad, so it's a pentagram, the 5-pointed star, and the 5-pointed star is the shape, the geometrical shape that the planet Venus makes every 8 years as it goes through the zodiac and comes back to the exact part of the zodiac where it started. So it's a reference to, an indirect reference to Venus, just as the mention of the horns in the previous theorem, where he says that she appears again horn-shaped, is a reference to Taurus, which is ruled by Venus. And then so, let's see, moving on then to the 6. Now with the 6, we've got the hexagram. So that's the Star of David. And the planet Mercury has a 6-year cycle that it goes through. It creates a hexagram in space. So there's Mercury, now an indirect reference to Mercury. And none of these things are free associations. That doesn't happen with Dee. Every association that comes to an educated mind is correct. He's including everything here. This is the whole sacred glyph that the entire cosmos can be constructed from. So here we see the sun and the moon supported by a rectilinear cross, which appropriately enough can signify a hieroglyphic account of the ternary as well as the quaternary. So he says ternary, not the Holy Trinity. He is a believing Christian, absolutely. But he's also a Christian Kabbalist, as Yates would term it. The ternary is simply any 3, any situation where you have a 3, such as Chokmah, or rather Keter, Chokmah, and Bina. That's a ternary as well. And the ternary is constructed in the text. I don't have the picture here from her video, but in the text that I'm reading, he turns the glyph upside down at this point. And so now what you'll see when you look at the glyph, turn it upside down, and the Aries horns become the symbol for fire, which is to say Keter, and then the plus sign in the middle, the cross with the 4 elements, then becomes the 4 middle of the Sephirot, and then the sun corresponds to Tifereth, and then of course the moon to Yesod, and then the earth is the elemental world, which will receive that. But you have to turn it upside down. But we'll get to that when we get to the 10th. Although he here in this text that I have, the Hamilton-Jones, for Theorem 6 has it turned upside down. So now in the diagram, the ternary, he says, is where you take the 2 lines and the point in the center is the 3rd term. That is the point that is the copulative mark. The copulative mark. So you get the ternary there, which is of course also body, soul, and spirit. So then the quaternary is what takes place when you take that cross and you turn it inside out, because it has 4 right angles there, so you turn it inside out and it becomes a square. Everything in Dee is about transformations. He really wants you to animate this in your imagination as you're going along and reading. He wants you to animate it. Think of it as transformations that are continually going on here. The cosmos is in constant motion for him. And then if you transform the square, then by putting it into 3 dimensions, then you get a cube. And a cube has a hidden octad because it has 8 vertices. So there's a hidden octad in the cube. And of course, the cube is the platonic solid that corresponds to the element of earth. It is Malkuth. And then when you transform the circle, you put it in 3 dimensions and it becomes a sphere with a center. And that's what he wants you to have that image in your mind when you're thinking about the sphere. All of these images should be animated. And then assuredly it refers to the ternary by way of the 2 straight lines and the common and seemingly copulative point that they share. So that's the ternary there, the 2 lines that intersect in the center to make a cross, which is the symbol for the elemental world, the 4 elements. And at the same time, it truly represents a quaternary by the 4 straight lines, which include the 4 right angles, which you turn inside out and you make a square. and then it becomes the cube of the earth. They are singular, twice, and for this occasion repeat in this way in this same place. An octad, even now, very secretly presents itself in a way which I doubt that our predecessors, the Magi, ever observed, and which you will much note. So that's the reference to the octad. He doesn't tell you this, but he wanted you to take those four angles, transform them into a square in your mind, and then transform that into a cube. Then you'll get the octad. A cube has 6 surfaces on it, 6 faces, and another ternary where 3 faces meet at each of the vertices. Each of the 8 vertices, 3 faces meet. So that's the beginnings of the cosmos, its foundation that we are building everything on. The magical ternary, he says, of the first fathers and wise ones corresponds to the body, the spirit, and the soul. Presumably by fathers and wise ones, he means characters like the demiurge in the Timaeus, but it could also just be the people who have been passing down the Hermetic tradition, as we see the Jewish Kabbalists and Pico della Mirandula, the Corpus Hermeticum, all of that has come down the chain, from which place we here have the manifest principle septenary. So if you combine the ternary with the quaternary, then you have the 7, the sacred number, septenary. Out of the 2 straight lines and a common point, then out of the 4 straight lines that are separated by 1 point. All right, so we have the sacred number, and this corresponds to Tifereth, where the corresponds in Kabbalah to the sun, which is the point of transformation. All right, let's move on to Theorem 7. Theorem 7, in the translation that I have here, the Hamilton-Jones translation, it's so bad that this theorem is completely unintelligible. I won't even bother to read it. We'll stick with Burns's correct translation. Elements that are removed from their natural habitations and whose homogeneous parts are from thence dislocated. Okay, so what does that mean? Now the sentence in Hamilton-Burns says, the elements being far from their accustomed places, the homogeneous parts are dislocated. And this a man learns by experiment. But what the hell is he talking about? She makes it clear here. The elements with a capital E are the Platonic forms of the elements, not the actual elements on the physical plane. Those are bad Xerox copies, so that's why it's capitalized. And they're removed from their natural habitations. They are displaced when the process of creation begins and it's set in motion and physical matter starts coming along. Those are the homogeneous parts, which are from thence dislocated from their origin, their archi. We'll teach an experimenter that they are naturally restored to their places by means of straight lines. In other words, what we're doing here with a ruler and a compass. We are drawing earthly reflections of ultimate pure Platonic forms, and in doing so, we are restoring them to their habitations where they belong in the Platonic realm. Accordingly, it will not seem absurd to insist that the mystery of the 4 elements, into which each primary substance can ultimately resolve, is intimated by the 4 straight lines that project out from a unique point into contrary directions. So if you look at the glyph here, the monad, so in the center of it we have the lines. So from that where they meet, from that place where they meet, we have a pair of lines that stretches outwards to infinity in either directions, in either direction, and the 4 lines too as well. Here you will carefully note what the geometers teach. A line, that is to say, capital L, a Platonic line, is produced from the outflowing of a point. So there are 2 points in this diagram. There's the point at the center, the elemental point where the 2 lines meet, but then there's the punctiform point up above, which is the point from out of which the Big Bang has taken place. Let's say, if you want to put it that way. Here, let's see. In using this same principle, we point out that this is also the case in our mechanical magic, that is to say, what we're using with our compass and ruler. That's the mechanical magic, because the lines indicating our elements are produced by the continuous fall of drops, which are like physical points moving as though they are flowing. They're like drops because when you construct a line is a series of infinite points, infinite drops that forms almost a river. So this is the first time he brings in the image of a river, of flowing, and thus a reference to Heraclitus's river that you can't step into. You can't step into the same river twice because it's the realm of becoming now. things are flowing and moving. And it's also a reference to the four rivers that stream out of the Garden of Eden and water or irrigate the entire world. And okay, that's Theorem 7. Moving on then to Theorem 8. Moreover, the Kabbalistic expansion of the quaternary. Now, so that's the first time that he's explicitly referred to Kabbalah, so we know he has it in his mind here. And what is a Kabbalistic expansion of the quaternary? It may be a reference to the four worlds. Remember that in addition to the 10 Sephirot, the Kabbalah, the emanations fall down through four worlds, all the way down to Asiya, which is equivalent to Malkuth. According to the customary phrasing of numbers, when we say 1, 2, 3, 4, notice that he capitalizes 1 because he wants you to put emphasis on it as the monad that is generative. It is the proto-generative monad, as I would call it, from out of which all the other numbers come. Produces in sum the denary, as Pythagoras himself used to say, 1, 2, 3, and 4 make 10. So down below here, notice that in her lecture, her wonderful lectures, I'm completely indebted to Professor Teresa Burns for illuminating me on this book, because I was really struggling with it, and she gets it right. So you should definitely order for her book from Ouroboros Press if you want the correct and clear translation. So this is a tetractys down here at the bottom, and the tetractys moves from a point. That would be the one with a capital O that he has there. If you start at the top, that's the Keter point, let's say. And then it splits into two, which is known as the Vesica Piscis, the opening, the Mandorla card in the Tarot of the World card, as we'll see, same thing, the opening through which the energies pour, and then down into 3, and then those emanate 4, and if you add them all up, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, they all make 10. In mythological terms, however, the point, the monad becomes the point in the center, which becomes Apollo, the sun god, around which the 9 muses dance. They revolve around him. So where you want to put the punctiform point just depends on your system of reference. So that's what he's talking about here. So in addition to the 10 Sephirot, we have these 10 points of the tetractys that were used. He's sort of combining them in a syncretic way. And as Burns puts it, the book is a syncretistic masterpiece of all these different traditions. It is not by chance, then, that the rectilinear cross, that is the 21st letter of the Roman alphabet. And so we have to look at the Roman alphabet. What is the 21st letter? So you count to 21, and it's the X. It's the St. Andrew's X. It's the cross of Christ. But notice that it's their symbol for the number 10. And 10 is the perfect number. How interesting that the cosmos has figured all of this out. So that is the 21st letter of the Roman alphabet, the rectilinear cross, as he calls it, St. Andrew's cross. Because Andrew was the disciple who didn't want to imitate Christ's crucifixion and wanted to humble himself and be crucified on a different instrument, which was considered to have been created out of 4 straight lines, was chosen by the most ancient of the Latin philosophers, namely Pythagoras, to signify the denary. It was decided that its location in the alphabet was to be where the ternary, multiplying its strength by the septenary, situates the letter. That is to say, 3 times 7 equals 21. Nice and neat. Everything fits together. And let's see if there's anything else. Okay, so he's introducing that cross, St. Andrew's cross, which will become important in some of the theorems that are beyond the 10th theorem. We're only doing up to 10 for this lecture. We may discuss more theorems in class, though. So let's look at Theorem 9. And again, notice that he does not write it as IX, but as a V with 4 lines, because the cosmos is not complete. We haven't reached Malkuth yet. We're at 9. One will also see that this coincides very well with the sun and moon of our monad, since through the magic of the same 4 elements, a most exact separation is made in their lines, and therefore by means of the circular motion of their lines. For according to the rules of geometry, the magnitude of any given line permits a circle to be described. A conjunction of the circle will be made in the solar complement. So one cannot fail to see how well the proportion of the denarii of the cross serves the sun and moon. So, okay, it's a bit obscure here. But what he's saying is that if we move the cross, the elements, we take that point and we move it up into the sphere, and so that the 2 points then coincide, then the elemental world is within the dodecahedral world. That is to say, the dodecahedron was the Platonic solid that corresponded to the ether, which is the shape of the universe, and according to Plato, it's circular, or spherical rather, and he's right. So Dee wants you to animate this in your mind as a sphere that is expanding from a mysterious center. And if you move the elemental center within it, then we have a sphere that is in motion with the elements that are moving. So now we're at the anima mundi from Plotinus, the anima mundi that is moving through the world and creating the planets and so forth. All right, so then let's look at the completion, at least of this stage of the narrative, which is Theorem 10. The sign of the dodecatemorion of Aries, which is very well known to everyone, has, according to the custom of astronomers, this somewhat sharp-edged and pointed form. Now, as Burns points out, so we know that the dodecahedron corresponds to the totality of the cosmic ether, which is spherical, and it also has the reference to the zodiac, the 12. But also there is a tradition which Dee has that's similar to the tradition of the decans, where you take 1/12, one sign of the zodiac, and then divide that into 10, 10, and 10. But Dee has divided it actually into 12, or subdivided each sign into 12, 12, 12, and so on. So that 12 times 12 will make 144, which is, of course, the number in the book of Revelation of those who will be saved at the end of time. 144,000 people are all that's going to be saved. So that's what he means by this. He's got this other astrological tradition of subdividing each sign into 12 12s. And it is well known that from this place in the heavens, the beginning of the fiery triplicity is designated. That is to say that the fire signs of Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, that's the fiery triplicity. For this reason, we have added the astronomical sign of Aries in order to signify that in monadic praxis, which is the practical application of these ideas, the ministry of fire is required. So, of course, Aries is a fire sign, and now we're bringing fire in because it's the fire of alchemy that he's referring to, the alchemical fire that is applied now to the transformation of the elements. They have to be heated up and then melted down into a negrito so that they can then be purified. So this is intellectual alchemy, as it were, that we're performing here. Thus we have here briefly brought forth one hieroglyphic consideration of our monad, which we want to express in a unique hieroglyphic construction as follows. So notice that in the diagram to the right, he has pulled the 4 elements apart and identified them as the moon, the sun, the elements, and fire with Aries. The moon and sun of our monad desire that their elements, in which the denarian proportion will flourish, be separated, and that this be done with the ministry of fire, so that the elements have to, in the crucible, the alembic, have to be separated, that is to say, torn apart like Osiris, and melted down before the gold can be extracted. But now, so this is interesting that Burns has in this diagram where if you turn upside down over here on the left, she has the whole thing upside down, and then we realize that we've been constructing in reverse order the Sephirotic world tree as we have over here, with Aries corresponding to fire. That's the appearance of the light, and that corresponds to Keter. And then the 4 elements are Chokmah, Binah, Chesed, Gevorah, and then the sun corresponds to Tiferet, and then Tiferet then reflects its light down to Yesod, which corresponds to the moon, and all of that comes in a broken fashion down to us fallen ones on Malkuth, which is all the way at the bottom. And so notice that it goes through almost like a thunderbolt, a zigzaggy kind of lightning flash that strikes the tree, the cosmic tree, and goes all the way down and radiates in broken form to us as the broken vessels, according to Isaac Luria, the Klippoth, these broken forms. Okay, so we'll pause there for those first 10, and then we'll discuss more of these theorems in class.